Nice.
You'll see the difference, and so will she.
I think you've gained a couple more fans, Tom.
Now you have a friend in the jewelry business, Shane Company.
You need shoes for when you work all day, and shoes for when you go outside and play. For all the things you do, you need shoes that keep up with you. From heel to toe, your feet just know. So trust the feeling in your soles. For comfort and style and every shape and size, follow your feet to Footwise.
When your feet feel good, you feel good. And when you feel good, anything's possible. Footwise has been making feet feel good for over 30 years, with expertise in shoes and feet and a wide array of comfort brands like Birkenstock, Keen, Naout, and Taos. Footwise has shoes for the whole family. Follow your feet to Footwise, next to Pete's Coffee in Portland on Northeast Broadway, or at footwise.com.
For comfort and style and every shape and size, follow your feet to Footwise.
The most news, traffic, and weather 24/7. On air, online, mobile. This is FM News 101 KXL FM, Portland, Vancouver, Salem.
Surrounded by rivers and majestic mountains, the picturesque city of Portland, Oregon is often referred to as a model American city. But there is another side to Portland, a seedier side.
Sell it, girl, sell it.
The city has more strip clubs per capita than Las Vegas. And with all nude shows and numerous sex stores, Portland has been dubbed Pornland.
My name is Brooke Axtell, and I'm a survivor of child sex trafficking and domestic violence. When I was 7 years old, my mom was hospitalized. During that time, I was entrusted to a nanny, and he sexually assaulted me. He forced me into child pornography and sold me to other men for sex. I was subjected to the most sadistic forms of abuse.
A lot of sexual abuse, mental abuse, like I couldn't get out of that situation. Like I had to do it to live, to survive.
The human sex trafficking issue in Portland. This is a special roundtable discussion from FM News 101 KXL. And now, Sheila Hamilton.
Thanks very much for joining us today, and thank you to OSU for that tape, that introduction. We have an incredible panel today that's going to be talking about the topic of sex trafficking. And if I would, first, each of you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role.
My name is J.R. Ujifusa. I'm a senior deputy district attorney for Multnomah County, and I supervise the human trafficking team in Multnomah County.
My name is Denise Bean. I'm a supervisory special agent with the FBI here in Portland, Oregon. I run the Violent Crimes Against Children program for Portland, FBI.
My name is Fabiana Wallace. I'm a psychologist here in Portland, and I specialize in working with people who have been traumatized and have severe trauma symptoms.
My name is Tanel Morton. I work for SARC, the Sexual Assault Resource Center, where we provide support advocacy that's confidential to trafficking survivors ages 18 to 25.
My name's Robin Miller. I'm the case manager and mentor at LifeWorks Northwest's New Options for Women program. We work with an adult population 18 and older who of victims who've experienced having been prostituted or trafficked.
JR, if you'd begin by just defining what sex trafficking is and tell us what the difference between sex trafficking and prostitution is.
Sure. I'm not going to give you a legal definition. There is a legal definition. It's a little different for the federal system versus the state. But in my view and how I think our office views sex trafficking is individuals, it involves prostitution, so sexual contact or conduct for a fee. And sex trafficking involves a third party who benefits in some way. So prostitution is sort of how we get to sex trafficking. Not all prostitution is sex trafficking, but the vast majority is.
Okay, if I were a prostitute and I wasn't paying a pimp, would I be considered a prostitute or would I be considered sex trafficked?
Just because you're not paying a trafficker, and I'm going to call you a victim,
yes,
or someone who has been engaged in prostitution rather than a prostitute, I think that we try to use that language. Just because you're not paying a trafficker does not mean that you're not sex trafficked. There are a lot of subtle manipulation, control, dynamics that go along with trafficking. And so that is why the definition that I gave, I think, is a broad definition that we work with, because we see, unlike the movie Taken or other sort of Hollywood ways of talking about sex trafficking, we see a lot of trauma bonding, manipulation, and control that may not look like paying a pimp. It may be other ways of manipulation that control individuals or make them feel like they are being exploited by someone else.
Dr. Wallace, would you talk about that a little, some of the psychological ploys that people use to lure these victims and to have them believe in them and this role that they take on?
Yeah. Perpetrators will scan people for vulnerability. So a lot of the victims have had trauma already in their lives, and so there's almost like a sense that there's a weakness, perhaps a vulnerability, I would say, as that's a better word, for people that have been in abuse situations as children in their homes, poverty, sometimes being racial minorities, being members of other minority groups, are all the targets that perpetrators prey on.
And Robin, I know that you're here to speak about your role as an advocate, but I'd like you briefly just to recount the experience you had as a victim. What kind of psychological obstacles were you dealing with at that time that allowed this to happen?
Well, my case, I wasn't sexually abused in my home. I do come from a house where alcoholism played a big role. I was sexually assaulted and physically abused in high school. I was chronic alcoholic at that time, so things were happening. My self-worth was, I didn't have any, and went away to college, and that just got worse. When I met my trafficker, I was 21 years old, and within 3 days, he moved me from Portland to Tacoma and then down to San Francisco, and that's where it began. But specifically, the abuse that I endured growing up was, from my circle of peers. Also, I was a gymnast and went through some pretty unhealthy things during those years as well.
I want to talk to Denise because she just mentioned something about within 3 days being moved to a different location. It seems like that's a very common ploy that I hear about, is that these pimps or these traffickers take women outside of any kind of support system that they may have and take them to different locations. Is that quite common?
Yes, it is, and you said it well. It's you isolate the victim from their typical support structure, from the places that they know, the people that they know, and so that when they're in this other community, they have no idea where to go for help. They're unfamiliar. They're unfamiliar with the streets, the roads, the people there. They could be absolutely not even aware of where they are in terms of the hotel location, because they all look alike. It could be at off of an interstate. So it's a very common tactic because it puts them off balance, and it takes them away from the supports that they may normally want to reach out to if they've felt like they were in danger.
Tanel, I've been reading backstories of so many of the cases in Oregon come from people who actually look like they're really together. They may be at a mall, or they have a young woman who's actually asking young women at malls if they'd be interested in modeling or if they'd be interested in a photography career. And many of these girls agree to go with a sex trafficker for the first time because they have dreams of stardom. Do you see that a lot in your business where you're talking to some of the victims who've gone through this?
We have definitely seen that. I think kind of what everyone's touched on more so is the vulnerabilities that everyone has touched on. If you think about being the average ages that we see as 14 to 15. And so if you think about being 14 and 15, just in itself, in a healthy environment, is a vulnerable age. And then you go ahead and layer that with some of the complex trauma that we see. And we see a lot of the oppression that and racial issues that the psychologist talked about as well. Like you layer that, and then you just got a very vulnerable young person.
JR, you mentioned Taken, and when I first heard about sex trafficking, that's my vision, is that it's complete strangers, you're minding your own business, and suddenly you're thrown in the back of the car and you're kidnapped. What percentage are those types of cases, and what percentage are just women who are vulnerable, who get talked into something, and then who end up really on the wrong side of this?
I can't give you a percentage, but what I will say is the vast, vast majority, and every case that I've seen in my office, is not the Taken model. It's more of what I would call the boyfriend or trust model, where a trafficker expands their boundaries while getting them to be comfortable with a form of sort of sex work, or getting them comfortable so that at some point they can then bring up the fact that they are now going to be engaging in prostitution. And so when we talk about, that's the reason I mentioned Taken, is because I didn't want us to work under that model, because that's not what we see. That's not the reality of what we deal with. It's much more, like I said, subtle. And it very, very many times it's almost a boyfriend model. It's the grooming and recruiting, almost like a loving boyfriend who looks or sounds almost too good to be true.
Wow.
And turns out to be working and manipulating and controlling them enough to get them to engage in sex trafficking at some point.
Denise, in the last year, give me an example of a case that fit this model that he's talking about, where especially as a parent, you should know about these types of men out there. Give me an example.
So I could speak to the case we just had. It went to trial, I believe, I want to say December, but it was Takarius Ford. And he spoke about the modeling and then whatnot. He was somebody who put himself out there as an individual who could further careers of potential models or people who wanted to be in Hollywood and have that Hollywood experience. He had photographs of himself with stars, and he had business cards, and he would actually fly women to Hollywood, and then slowly, like JR mentioned, slowly infiltrate them into the process of being a sex worker. And it was a insidious process. It didn't happen all at once. And again, and it also brings up that being off balance, right? They're in Hollywood, they're away from their support system, and now they're being asked to go to this party. And then, well, while you're at this party, it's expected that you're going to go ahead and engage in some sex work. And so it just slowly built over time. And that case went to trial, and he was successfully convicted, and the trauma bonding was part of that. We had a expert who had to testify with respect to the trauma bonding, because you have to explain, in this case they were adult females, how does an adult female get in a situation where they feel like they can't leave or won't leave or are giving over a stack of money to somebody when that person's not forcing them physically to do that. And so that trauma bonding was a very important part of the trial, and that case I think has a lot of the elements of everything that we've talked about thus far.
I want to talk with Dr. Wallace about this, because in this case, correct me if I'm wrong, Denise, but he also took pictures of the person so that later he could kind of blackmail them with pictures of them having sex, correct? Is that one, or am I confusing some of the cases I've been reading?
Yeah, he did have photographs. I don't remember the detail with respect to blackmail. Do you, JR, on that one?
So in that case, it was myself and AUSA Leah Bolstad who tried that case. I think that's a common theme throughout all these cases, is using pictures and videos and the fact that they're engaging in prostitution acts as a way to keep them doing it and making them fearful that if they leave, their family and friends would find out. For some of those victims, yes, there was those threats of family and members of their group of friends finding out about what they were doing.
Dr. Wallace, what happens? I'm a healthy, stable person. I can imagine falling for the first part of this, where someone says, hey, if you come with me, I can make you a star. I can picture myself in that. But there's a certain line I can't cross, and that is when they say, and now you have to have sex at this party. Describe for me this trauma bonding. What happens to a woman that she suddenly is crossing her own moral boundary?
Yeah, I think that the best perspective is not to look at it from the victim's perspective, but from the manipulation of the perpetrator. So, first of all, when it's in the context of a relationship or a friendship even, there is a level of shock that happens. And you know how sometimes you say, somebody said something mean to you at a party and you didn't know how to respond, and a day later you're like, oh, I should have said this and that. That happens to all of us. So you can, multiply that by 1,000,000 when somebody all of a sudden that you trust and you have a relationship with comes up with a suggestion that's completely outside of what you were expecting. So, and what happens is that there are, 7 key areas that get impacted by trauma. And one of them is a sense of self. So we start changing our sense of self, like, our self-esteem, who we are, what we deserve, what we don't deserve in life. And also perceptions of the perpetrator. So there is, during that whole manipulation process, all these things start playing in. And what people are not aware of a lot of the times is that our central nervous system is wired to respond with survival responses to a lot of these unexpected situations. So as soon as our brain decides that there is a danger or a threat, these survival responses will kick in, which are fight, flight, and freeze. And the last resort one is feigned death response. And there's additional ones that psychologists have proposed based on attachment literature. But so that's what affects people in making decisions, because when the central nervous system, when that switch gets flipped, our frontal cortex, so it's the part of our brain that makes all the planning and executive decisions and all this kind of stuff, just goes offline. Because in survival, if I have to run from a bear, I'm not going to think, well, should I put my shoes on first, or should I, that all goes away so that I can just run.
Right.
And ensure survival. So we're just wired that way. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about how somebody reacts in the moment when we don't take that into account. Or, unfortunately still, in some places people believe like if a woman doesn't fight, then it's consensual.
I love this description that the executive functioning is completely wiped out, and they're just stealing from the amygdala, which is that very reptilian part of our brain.
Yeah, it's the brainstem.
Yeah. Wow, really interesting. Robin, I find the work that you're doing now so interesting, because you went through this, and now you see these women probably at the beginning of when they're attempting to recover from it. Describe for me what they're like when they're coming to you.
Well, a lot of times, so our program provides mental health and chemical dependency treatment, as well as a case management. And once they're meeting me third. So they've done an assessment with both counselors, and they come in and it's almost like, it's just like a blank kind of stare. And when I share with them, I introduce myself, kind of share my own experience, it's almost like something just falls off and they kind of exhale or they breathe. And then we just connect at a little, at a level of understanding. They know that, from some of the things I share with them, they know that I'm not lying, and it just makes it a lot easier, I think, to do the work and to feel supported. But, we have women, we serve women 18 and older. And so we've had a young person come on her 18th birthday because she knew about the program and was directed there by another survivor. And then we also serve women who've been in the life for 30 years. And they mostly have started at that adolescent age, before they were adults, and they might, and always, have had at some point throughout the 30 years, a trafficker, a pimp. And when they've been in that long, a lot of times it's the drugs that you really see controlling their decisions and keeping them in the life like that.
And so how often are the drugs used just to numb themselves from the trauma that they're experiencing?
Often. I mean, what woman can imagine going out there and doing something like that. You know, I like to use the term commercial sexual exploitation because it covers the entire kind of sex industry. And even like for women who are dancing in clubs, it's the same thing. Anybody I've ever known, well, I'm sure there are a couple that didn't drink or use, but most of the women that, you know, get up on stage are also having to numb or, you know, get that liquid courage going or something. And, you know, it helps to dissociate from the reality.
I want to talk to Tanel because there's going to be somebody watching online, perhaps a dancer, who's going to say, that's my choice. That's the way that I exhibit my art. I'm a feminist and I feel emboldened being on stage. How do you respond to them?
That's a very complex question for sure. And I think it's something that we do get asked. I think, you know, at SARC, to access our services, you have to have had a third party benefiting. So specifically, that's the population I work with, right? And so I do hear that there is another percentage, but I, from the work that I do and have been doing for 7 years, I believe it's a very small percentage that are able to do it with a free choice. And then I would also say, the women who are able to do that, I think it's a very privileged group, a very small privileged group that are able to get in and get out, right? Without having a trafficker approach them, having a trafficker get in and manipulate the situation. So I think it's a very complex issue. I'm familiar with the population that benefits from a third party being involved.
JR, I've had so many arguments with people in Portland about this because we do have one of the highest numbers of sex clubs and strip clubs in the nation. That's because of our free speech laws. They claim that it's all in good fun and that everybody goes there willingly. And I said, no, it's a huge hub for prostitution and for sex trafficking. Who's right? I'm going to win some bets here today.
Well, I can say that clubs play a major role in recruiting and grooming the vast majority of the victims that we see, I think, throughout this panel. And so, as Tanel said, I'm sure there are individuals out there who are able to be privileged enough to choose to go in there and not feel like they have a lack of choices and be able to leave when they want because they don't have a lack of financial choices or relationship choices. But the vast majority of individuals that I deal with as victims of sex trafficking, adult clubs and adult shops and sort of that legalized sexual entertainment is used to expand their boundaries as a means of getting them to engage in prostitution.
I want to move to the crime fighting part of this, Denise, if we could. What's your most effective tool in combating sex trafficking?
I'd say our most effective tool is working with our partners and all of our partners on all the different levels, because it's a multifaceted problem that we've already talked about today. It's got issues in psychology. It has issues in socioeconomic status. It has to do with family dynamics. It has to do with individual vulnerabilities. So in law enforcement, we can't arrest our way out of this. We can't indict enough out of it. So we have to work together kind of as a community in order to address the issue. So, you know, people at this table, we know each other, we work with one another. We are each other's safety net when it comes to addressing this crime problem. So for me, that's our biggest tool. Our biggest asset is the community that we live in and our partners and knowing who one another are and what we can bring to the table.
I recently was reading up on a really sickening case in which a young mother attempted to sell sex with a 3-year-old child. She did it all online through obviously kind of black market websites, chat rooms. How often are your people in those chat rooms attempting to actually monitor or catch this kind of act?
A lot. We have undercover operations, and when we have some specificity about a particular individual, we will go ahead and engage in undercover activities to try to address that conduct that we have learned about. But all across the country, not just the FBI, but local law enforcement as well, are constantly in the online arena attempting to address those individuals that are going to misuse that tool to expand the child sexual exploitation trade.
So once again, back to the model that the entertainment industry delivers to us, that it's taken and that the girls are taken on this national stage and they're put up for some sort of auction. It sounds much more often like it is person to person, family to family, exploiter to exploiter. Would that be more accurate?
I think that I haven't even seen the movie Taken, so I can't even say. I do like Liam Neeson though, but
don't we all?
But it's about relationships, right? And it's about the community that you're in. It is very rare for somebody to just be snatched off the streets. I mean, even when we talk about child abductions, that's a very rare occurrence to have a stranger abduct a child. And so to have this situation where you have a stranger taking a minor female or even a young adult and thrusting them into the sex trafficking world, it's extremely rare. What happens is there are relationships. You're somewhere where you're approached by someone. You're at the Max stop, you're at the Lloyd Center, you're in school, you're online, and somebody that you maybe haven't met before, maybe is a stranger to you, starts to communicate with you in whatever context. If that's face-to-face at the Lloyd Center, hey, how are you doing? What are you doing here today? I love your hair. You look great. That type of approach. Or are you on the Max? Hey, where are you headed? Do you want to come over? We're having a house party. You just don't know how that approach is going to be. And one thing I try to tell young people too is that it could be a woman that approaches you. So we talk so much about hey, it could be this adult male that's going to try to groom you or entice you. It very often could be a woman who's doing that on behalf of another trafficker.
Dr. Wallace, what goes on in the mind of a woman who allows herself to exploit other women, especially younger women? And then follow-up question, what goes on in the mind of a mother who so disassociates the relationship with her 3-year-old child that she can begin to think that?
Well, it is something hard to understand, especially as a mother myself. But you have to, it's really hard to answer that question because there's got to be a ton of factors that are affecting that person's capacity to think or the level of desperation. I mean, there's just some horrible, perfect storm that has created that situation. And again, in a lot of those situations, there are probably, if there are substances involved, so there's not really a sort of premeditated, planned, thing that happens, that it's more impulsive or, some idea that happens spontaneously. It can be that happened to her, when she was 3, something like that. So, it's really hard to understand, and you don't understand until you meet the person. So I get to work for, usually long-term with people, and I really get to understand, all the decisions that they've made, the good ones and the bad ones. And so...
What happens? Why are people who were victimized, who went through that trauma, what is that replication of trauma again? Why do we do it as human beings?
Well, I just want to clarify that that's not the relationship. So you have a lot of people that have been traumatized that never perpetrate abuse.
Right.
And so I think it's not necessarily that common. It depends, again, on a lot of factors. Sometimes gender makes a difference. In some studies, girls are abused more within the home with people that are very close to them, so like a relative or very close friend. And sometimes for boys, the abuse happens in outside of the home, and it's more physical and less sexual, for example. So there are, and it's hard to really know exactly what's going on and what the numbers are. But and so you have all the socialization about like how, unfortunately still gender socialization is pretty strong. And so when you have these stereotypical ideas, then kids start acting the way they think they should be acting based on their gender. And man, it's... I don't have a better answer than that. Sorry.
Robin, what has been the most productive sequence of events that can occur for a woman who comes to you for help?
Well, timing. We've had women show up. When I was with a woman yesterday who, when I got there, the program coordinator that hired me, she had worked with her just briefly and pretty much counted it, like wrote her off as she was probably not ever going to be back, that she in fact might even be deceased. Something could have happened to her. And she came in about 2 years ago when I first started, and she just engaged with the program. She just did I don't want to say the work. It is work. It's a lot. It's hard work. Showing up to groups, showing up to her individual counseling sessions, asking for help, connecting with community resources that could provide, education, job training, and just staying part of that, just staying in the middle of the program and connected with other survivors, other women who are going through the same thing that she was going through. So, we've walked with her. She was homeless, and now, about a year ago, she has permanent housing with her almost 2-year-old boy. She was in the car with me yesterday. We picked up her driver's permit, and she's over 30. And then on the way back, we stopped off. She had to do a drug test for a potential job that she was looking to get, and she was hired. She starts next Friday.
Wow. So it's the same path everybody else wants. A house, a roof over your head, a good job, people who love you, essentially, right?
Well, and then, it's really hard. One thing that holds a lot of women, in bondage is this money, this real fast money. And we, even women who say, this is my choice. Well, it is, because for the very small percentage that are privileged, because, it's easy, quick, fast money, and women don't always have the same opportunities to earn at the same level as men. And so it's a way to earn even more. But my experience, it never ends with any big sum in your pocket, or, it's pretty much all given away.
What happened to you that allowed you to finally get out of the sex trafficking industry?
Well, I'm a Christian woman, and I know it was my prayer, my family's prayers, and it was the time. I had support that I had connected with at a rehab center a year before I finally got out for good, and those 2 women came and picked me up from Tacoma. And it was just, I did a intensive, residential program, and just kept going, connected with a fellowship that most of the church, I can't think of the name, people that go to congregation, were kind of coming from a life, not typical, not straight-laced so much. They had some exposure to the streets and that kind of lifestyle. So it was just that fellowship of people, but I didn't have programs. There was no program like the one, like all of the ones we have today. There weren't survivors who were doing work in the movement and reaching out to support and lift others up.
Tanel, when I used to be a reporter in TV, we could actually see the women walk when they were prostituting. And then I remember the transition when everyone got pagers and all the women disappeared and they were just paging each other from, their hotel rooms. Now, what is the preferred method of communicating that these sex traffic workers that you see, what are they doing, and how is the business evolving that we may not know about?
Sure. I think that the progression has been great and quick. I mean, even when I started 7 years ago, I think we all kind of are familiar with the track being on 82nd in Portland, right? And so it was a very active place even 7 to 8 years ago. And the progression has been dramatic. I think we see most, and I think law enforcement knows way more than I do, but that we do see it being very internet-based, very app-based, very social media-based. And so it's harder to kind of see and pinpoint where it is happening exactly, because it's a little bit more enmeshed in all of that, which young adults are doing 24/7.
Denise, is it true that this crime is now as big a problem in the suburbs because it has moved to the internet, because we don't have a center for sex trafficking anymore?
Absolutely. I say if you have a hotel, you have sex trafficking.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And it's not just hotels too. I mean, there's apartments or personal homes, car dates, But yeah, everything, not everything, but a majority of the sexual exploitation is now occurring through an online venue. That's how dates are made. And then that date can happen anywhere. But generally speaking, that's where we see the majority of the dates happening.
I sort of remember the evolution where law enforcement moved from focusing on the victim, which was the woman being sex trafficked, to the perpetrator. Was that a conscious choice? Was that a legal choice? How did that happen, if you would, JR?
Sure. In my experience, in 2008, we were tasked with working on 82nd Avenue to help out the neighborhoods. That was the original goal with Portland Police Bureau and the DA's office, is to help those neighborhoods that were affected by acts of prostitution. And as we learned more, we learned that these were individuals who had lack of choices, that were being manipulated and controlled. And we changed the focus to looking at the manipulators, the people who were trafficking them, but also the demand. We haven't talked about the demand yet, and I think that's very important. The men who are fueling this economy. Without demand, this crime would not exist. And we talk about money. Money is the center point of this crime, and that money comes from men in the suburbs, men in the cities, wherever. And so that change happened rapidly, I would say, right around 2009, 2010, focusing on helping victims get out of the life, identifying them as victims, helping them others understand that they are victims, and focusing on prosecuting, arresting, and reducing the demand and the sex traffickers that were manipulating, controlling, and running this industry.
Denise, it seems to me that if I'm a man and I can make all of this arrangement in the comfort of my home on the internet, that I'm far more likely to participate in this than I would if I had to drive my car to 82nd Avenue and risk picking someone up.
I think that's entirely true, and what you said is key, the risk, right? If you're driving and you're actually picking someone up off the street, the chances of you being observed engaging in that conduct are high, because like JR alluded to, there has been a real effort to address street crime, prostitution, street-level sex trafficking, and it's been very successful. With the advent of making the dates online and meeting somebody at a hotel or calling them to your home, that risk has been greatly diminished.
Dr. Fabiana, one of the very interesting things for me was that program To Catch a Predator. And when you listen to those men talk about the reasons that they're there, they're often really deluding themselves. Like so many times, the man will sit down after he's made an appointment with a minor to have sex with them and say, I came here to help this girl. Mm-hmm. What is it in the mind of a perpetrator that they begin to think that way?
Well, I don't work with perpetrators. I work with victims. So
lucky you.
So I don't. That's like a whole separate field within psychology, and so I have to pass on that one. But it's.
Go ahead, JR.
Yeah.
So my experience, Multnomah County has a sex buyers school at John School.
Yeah.
Where we have men who are arrested for misdemeanor crimes, and they take an anonymous test. They go through a class at LifeWorks and SARC, and law enforcement are involved in. One of the things I think goes to answer your point is these men don't see themselves as part of the sex trafficking problem because they have believed, because sometimes it's the way in which sex trafficking is sold, that these are women who enjoy this work. These are adult women who, this is their choice, they enjoy this work. And so these men, mostly men are buyers, mostly victims are women, although we know that there are male victims as well. They look at them and say, oh, I'm paying them. I'm helping them because I'm paying them and they enjoy to do this. When they realize, and the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about this is because these men, after sitting through a full day class and going through the criminal justice system and realizing where their money actually goes and what they fund, these men realize that they're not helping them, that these are victims who are usually being exploited, manipulated by someone else, and their money is actually going to fund those traffickers. And so originally I think they do think they're actually helping because they're ignorant and don't realize actually what sex trafficking looks like.
I wonder if any of you, even amongst yourself, have had the debate about whether or not if prostitution was legalized, we could eliminate the sex trafficking circles. No? Oh, wait. Oh, good. I love that.
Absolutely don't agree with that.
Okay,
statement
good. I'm
because
so
it
glad.
only-
I want you to tell me
think
why.
If it was full legalization, it would only drive it, make it easier for traffickers. You see countries, Amsterdam. I'm not an expert in this, but it's just my own opinion. In Amsterdam, and I was a woman I know who works, in the anti-trafficking kind of movement, even believed that all those women, that was their choice. And it's absolutely not. I mean, it makes it so much higher rates of trafficking happening.
We have traffickers in Portland and surrounding areas that send their victims to counties in Nevada that they are legal. And so even those individuals where it's legal to be engaged in prostitution or sex work, they're still being trafficked.
Wow.
And I think actually what happens is if it were to be legal, from my perspective, it would be harder for law enforcement to identify violence and control and minors being involved in prostitution, because they wouldn't be looking for that because it would be a legal industry.
Tanel, how many of the women who have come into your program have also been the victims of violence?
I would say a very, very high percentage. But we do see, we see it's because it is such a form of manipulation and can be that boyfriend experience. There's not always violence, but there is a very high percentage of violence that happens within this lifestyle as well. And that can be, sometimes violence is used as a form of force to keep them in.
Robin, same?
Oh yeah, it's very rare that somebody doesn't have. In my needs assessment, we go through those things. Have you been a victim of a crime? Have you been a victim of violence? And it's interesting. Sometimes there's a pause, and they haven't necessarily even made that connection that what happened to them was violence, was a crime, or they'll say no, and then they'll wait. Oh wait, this one guy. And it happens on both ends. It's, doesn't just happen with the man or the person who's trafficking a victim. It happens when you get in a car or you get into a hotel room and that door shuts behind you. And I think that's when it happens more. And again, it's the men driving the demand. And, I've spoken to a group of men at the program. And when I get in, I often tell them, I said, I know that there's probably at least one person in here who has assaulted a woman, raped a woman, and potentially even killed somebody. I mean, it's just how much it happens.
What's the biggest misconception? I want each of you to answer this. What's the biggest misconception you've heard people have about the sex trafficking industry? JR?
That's a really tough question. I don't know if this is the biggest, but one of the misconceptions is this happens to just foster poor children. This happens, as we talked about, I think Tanel talked about how when you're 14 and 15 years old, you're struggling with your self-identity, your self-worth. And one of the biggest misconceptions is that victims, I think the biggest common denominator is self-esteem. And so victims can be your neighbor, they can be your child, they can be kids who go to your church, who are in school. I think it's really easy for people to put this off into some other one, somebody else's child, or people who, kids that don't have parents. And what we've seen is victims from all over. So one of the biggest misconceptions is that this happens to just poor foster children. This happens to all sorts of children. And then the other one, I think, is the demand side, that misconception that these women or men or children enjoy this, that they're doing it because they love it, because they're doing it because they're independent and this is the way in which they make a living, as opposed to because they have a quota, because if not, they'll have some sort of consequence if they don't bring home the money that they are required to.
Denise?
JR took my answer.
Oh. Dr. Wallace?
No, I was just kidding.
Oh, good. Woo!
No, I would say, that this is a victimless crime. That I hear so often, this is the oldest profession, that type of statement. And I don't think that very many women ever want to or have this be a professional aspiration. When I grow up, I want to be a sex trafficked individual, or I want to work in the sex industry. That's not an aspiration that you'll hear from little girls. So I would say that that's, for me, one of the biggest misconceptions is that this is something to strive to be, or that this is a profession, quote unquote, and that that there's no victims, that it's a supply demand. You get paid. I had this experience. And I feel like the entire aspect of it is just dehumanizing. And I think as a society, we have to recognize that dehumanization, and that that's not a profession. It's not a job. It shouldn't be anyone's job to provide sexual services to somebody else.
Oh, yeah, well said. Dr. Wallace.
I think the issue of choice, when we talk about trauma-informed care, which is that model of trying to have everybody in the world understand trauma and its consequences, it's this idea of there are real choices, and there's, and there's things that look like choices and they're not choices. I work with people that had to engage in sexual acts in order to prevent their sister from getting hurt, for example. And they still, as adults, that, they just say, well, but I made that choice. It's like, well, let's really think about that. Really, was it really a choice? And so, and as a society, of course, we assign the choice. And going back to the this other question about the men who solicit these services, it's obviously there's an amount of denial under operation there in order to just think that this is an okay thing. So, and the other piece is the violence. I think that there's this misconception that violence is physical when we think about it, and when we ask the question sometimes, and we're asked that question, we try to think about that, but there's a lot of this emotional and psychological violence that happens, and it's sweet talking, right? It doesn't look like violence, and it's very pervasive, and it really changes how people think about themselves and their choices and their options in life.
Tanel.
I think what can get lost in conversations like this is because it is such a hard issue, and it is dark and heavy. I think what can get lost is that human piece, right? And so I think what's important and what is a misconception is that there's so much damage done that they're not able to come out of it. And I think what I see every day in my space, and the girls I talk to every day, are that they are so resilient, that they're so strong, that they are so intelligent, and that they're so insightful. And in our drop-in space, it's filled with laughter, and we actually have a lot of fun, and we come together as a community to help kind of rebuild some things in their lives that have been damaged. But I think these conversations can feel so dark, and that there is actually a lot of lightness and love and laughter in the young adults and youth that I see every day. So I think that that's important to remember too.
And Robin?
Well, I think everybody took my answers. But speaking to what Denise said about it being the oldest profession, I've often heard, I was waiting for you to say it's the oldest oppression, because that is something that, I believe. Also, the choice piece, and what a lot of the men who buy believe that these girls, teenage girls, want to be with them, or even, the adult woman who's been on heroin for 20 years wants to be with them. Nobody wants to be with them. A woman, she's a survivor out of Ireland. She wrote a book called Paid For. It's an amazing read. It's very complex and deep, but she, what I'm remembering, it's paid rape. That's what it is. Nobody makes this choice. We wouldn't, pick you to go on a date with or pick you as our partner. But you're paying for us, and you have that money that we need so we don't get beat up when we go home, or that we need for, our fix, or we need to pay our rent or buy our diapers for our babies. And so it's paid rape. It's not a choice at all.
And I want to just go back down the line and say, in your organization, in your capacity, in the role that you're serving now, what tool, what assistance could you have that could help you combat sex trafficking in our region?
I guess just my personal lived experience. I mean, it's one of the most amazing things I have at my job is to support the support I have from my coworkers, trained, mental health professionals. So, I don't know what else I need.
But I'm wondering if when the women in your group or they want to access it, is it difficult to get these services?
Oh, we need housing specific to the population, both for adults and minors. We need professionals who are willing to mentor and invest in survivors. We need community resources. Everything that you would need to be successful is the same thing that victims of trafficking need to be successful.
And how do you get your funding currently?
Well, gosh, this is probably a better question for JR or my supervisor who's not here. We have a federal grant.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I would pass this to JR.
JR, go ahead and you answer that. What tools, what resources do you need to help combat sex trafficking in our region?
So I want to first start by saying I think the collaborative effort we have in Portland is amazing. And so I think a lot of cities and other areas don't have already what we have, but of course we could always do a better job. I think the two things that I see would be helpful in sex trafficking as a whole is one, awareness. Awareness, sort of like what we're doing today, right? People listening on the radio, understanding that this isn't someone in a cage from another country. This is a local child being manipulated, isolated, and controlled. So awareness, because those people make up juries, and they make up people who donate money, and they make up people who may see something that need to report it. And the other one is prevention. And prevention for not only victims, right? But also for perpetrators, whether it's a trafficker, a would-be trafficker, or a would-be buyer, teaching kids how to have healthy relationships, how to treat one another, how to view them as humans, understanding that this isn't what men do. Purchasing a woman isn't just part of being a man. It's not okay. And I think those two things would help all of our roles be better, is awareness and prevention.
I want to just follow up on that, JR, because I talked to a psychologist who said he was dealing with an awful lot of 13, 14, 15-year-old boys who'd grown up on porn from the age of 7 and 8, and their ability to develop healthy sexual relationships with girls was really difficult because they had these very aberrant views of what was normal. So what would you say for parents out there around this issue of teaching young men, especially, a healthy view of sexuality?
I think young men need to see how their mothers are treated. I think young men need to see how their sisters are treated and other women in their community. I think it's not just the discussion of pornography is probably another hour session, but I think music, how we use the words such as pimping, how we talk about women in a sexual way and how they're used as sort of an object, and also sort of men who also perpetuate the, using women is a good thing. All those things roll into sex trafficking, and they make it worse.
Wonderful. Denise, if you would.
I agree with JR with respect to the education piece. I think that's really important, both on the supply side and the demand side. And I think that education has to start really young. And I think, if we can teach our children what it means to be, a positive sexual relationship and to be alert and aware on the internet in their communities. And then we need to think about and care about our missing children, no matter where they're from or what families they're from or what communities they're from. We really need to focus on trying to find those kids and bring them back home and get them in a stable situation where they can grow and be healthy.
What does a person like myself do, just a regular citizen, toward that effort? How do I help?
Well, I don't know. That's hard. There's a lot of organizations that focus on both this population but also on children specifically. And so I would say I would go towards that. But if you have the ability to know about this topic and teach this topic, because we're asked a lot, here we are today on Saturday, we're asked a lot to speak to our communities about sexual exploitation of children, and there's just a few of us. And so the more that we could expand on that and have, you sound really very well versed on this topic as well, to have people out there in the community meet with community groups, meet with groups of children to talk about the issues, I think would be really helpful. but it can't come all the time from law enforcement. You know, the kids need to talk to survivors or to someone who's hip and cool like Tanel, and you know, instead of us. They don't want to chat with me, which is fine, but they need to be able to speak to somebody who understands them.
I love that. Fabiana.
Well, in terms of tools, as a psychologist, we are in a very exciting period as a field because we have so much neuroscience information that we're using that has led to a lot of interventions that are body-centered. So not just talk therapy. I do two trauma-specific interventions called EMDR and sensory motor psychotherapy. And they are amazing, and you can eliminate a lot of the need for conversation. I think one of the barriers is that, you know, it's not high on people's list to go to do trauma therapy. We could use more mental health providers that are trained specifically to work with trauma. It's not the same. I work with a lot of people that have had years of psychotherapy. Their therapist knew that they had this trauma history in their lives, but they just focused on the depression, let's say. And so, you know, you can't do sort of just regular therapy as usual, supportive therapy to address trauma. You really need specific tools. So that's something that I try to do a lot in terms of teaching and supervising and having therapists have real tools. And also, like what you were talking about, that we do groups and also in individual. It's not all about talking about the trauma. There's a lot of positive things that come out. There's you know, being in therapy for trauma. Sometimes I work with people for years and I don't know all the details of what happened to them. So you don't need to get into that detail. And it still makes space for these other memories of childhood that are positive, you know, and clients reconnecting with some teacher that they had totally forgotten about and actually found her. She was still alive. This was a man in his 50s. And, you know, it just, all those little things. So therapy, you know, there needs to be some education to make therapy a little more palatable for people to sign on to, but amazing things can happen.
Robin, to Dr. Wallace's point about trauma and how the body keeps the score, I want you to describe what it was like to probably suffer from the PTSD of what you'd experienced, and at what point did you begin to feel better? And how did that feel to know that you were forging this new path as a woman and as a human being?
So it was, I got out of the life in 1999. I don't think I was completely free and healed from this until about 2009, 2010, when I started researching the issue of trafficking. And, you know, I was reading stories. I was reading my story in, you know, online and in books, and connecting with women who've gone through the exact same thing. And seeing myself, you know, I'm not a victim today. I always was very culpable for my choices, and which kind of, I think, kept me not free from it. When I looked at myself and I saw, wow, something happened to you. You know, you were a victim of something. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I accepted and I understood that. And then, like, you know, immediately I'm a survivor, you know, just knowing that it wasn't a choice that I made and that I wasn't that person.
And is there anybody else who could just offer any advice for parents that are watching today about this conversation they should be having, especially with young women at that crucial age, 13, 14, just some basic warning signs? If you want to go, JR, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. Be involved. Yeah. Know who their friends are. Know where they're going. If there is something that doesn't seem okay, whether it's an older boyfriend or they're hiding things from you, try to understand what that is and listen, and make your home somewhere where these kids can talk about things. Because what we see is we see individuals approach, whether it's a male or a female, and that's a big sign that if they told their parents or told their peers who cared about them, that may have stopped just then. And so I think being involved with your children, knowing what they're up to, and also being open for them to speak with you is a really important thing.
Anyone else want to add anything before we close today?
I was just going to say, be that annoying parent.
Absolutely. Thank you, JR, Denise, Dr. Fabiana Wallace, Tanel, and Robin. Thank you. You were just a wonderful panel. I'm Sheila Hamilton. We've been talking today about sex trafficking in the region. Thank you very much. You can see this again on KXL's Facebook page. We'll be putting this on YouTube as well. And once again, thank you to our panel.
Thanks. Thank you.